Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review, and today we have Jaycob Megna. So just like my previous reviewed player, Jacob Middleton, Megna was a player who was not really in the Sharks' plans, or seemingly in the Sharks' plans at the beginning of this past season. And, you know, for those of you who might be thinking, oh, Megna is some sort of young player who just suddenly appeared on the scene for the Sharks, this is very much not the case. Megna is 29 years old, having played his first game in the NHL 5 years ago back in the 16-17 season. To put that into perspective, that was the year that Brent Burns won the Norris Trophy as the league's best defenseman, and that feels like eons ago, and yet that was when Megna played his first game. Prior to this season, Megna's last games in the NHL were actually in the 18-19 season with the Anaheim Ducks, so Megna missed 2 full years at the NHL playing in the AHL, the 1920 and 2021 seasons. And so coming into this year for Megna, he probably wasn't thinking he'd play many games, if any, for the San Jose Sharks. It would take some sort of catastrophic set of injuries for Megna to be called up, and he would likely only end up playing a few games here or there. His odds of playing over half the season, I feel as though, were extremely low. However, considering the circumstances, he actually got, in a way, rather lucky, as it wasn't a catastrophic set of injuries that opened up this opportunity for Jaycob Megna, but it was instead an unlucky set of COVID tests. You see, near the end of October, early parts of November, the early parts of the season generally, the Sharks were hit with multiple positive COVID tests, which caused the majority of their defensive unit to actually have to sit out for a few games. This included Karlsson, Middleton, Šimek, and Vlasic, and so the Sharks were scrambling and had to call up a bunch of players from the AHL, and so Milosh came up, Hataka came up, Merkley came up, and of course Megna came up as well. And so while Burns and Ferraro were both still healthy and ended up taking a pretty hefty increase in terms of ice time, it was obviously not feasible for those two players to play like 45 minutes a night, which means some of these players called up, in particular Megna, would have to take on a relatively sizable amount of ice time. And like I said, Megna was one of these players, in particular in one of those games that they did play during the sort of COVID situation for the Sharks, which was against the Buffalo Sabres. Megna played almost 24 minutes, which was a career high for him, and the only other time he even managed to reach the 20-minute mark in his entire, although rather short, career was all the way back in the 17-18 season, when he did it a single time with the Anaheim Ducks against the Montreal Canadiens, and in that game he only played about 22 minutes, so 2 more minutes in this game against the Buffalo Sabres, and he performed quite strongly. This was one of his better games of the entire season. However, after the COVID situation had passed, the Sharks had regained their main defensive unit, and so Megna was sent back down to the AHL, and maybe that was going to seemingly be his only breakout chance in the league this year. Those 6 games were just going to come and go. But that would not be the case, as in January the Sharks would start to deal with some defensive injuries. We saw Karlsson end up sitting out a bit, Ferraro ended up sitting out a bit, and so Megna managed to come back into the lineup, and he would never actually step back out for any sort of actual amount of time, and he'd play most of the rest of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks, and not in some sort of extremely diminished and small role of 12 minutes a night on the third pairing. No. In fact, even above players like Vlasic and Šimek, who have been much longer mainstays, in particular Vlasic has been a massive mainstay on the San Jose Sharks throughout his entire career, dating back all the way to the mid-2000s. Megna ended up being a guy who would pretty consistently average a good 19 to 20 minutes down the stretch in those last 30-something games that he would end up playing near the end of the season, getting pretty frequent time with players like Brent Burns and like Erik Karlsson when he did return to being healthy, and he would do a rather admirable job at that. In fact, it was very, very similar to what Jaycob Middleton did when I reviewed him just a few days ago, which was that these guys came pretty much out of nowhere and actually looked pretty good in the roles that they were inserted into, right? This wasn't just Megna riding the coattails necessarily. His shot attempts percentage, so based on the amount of shots he had when he was on the ice as a unit with the other 4 players, as well as the amount of shots he faced, was actually, relative to the rest of the team, a positive player for the San Jose Sharks. On top of that, Megna had one of the lowest offensive zone start percentages on the entire team. In terms of defensemen, only Milosh ended up finishing below him in that particular stat, so Megna wasn't even necessarily put into a situation to succeed all that frequently, and yet relative to his peers, he ended up being a player with a positive shot attempt percentage, so quite impressive in that regard. And what makes this an even stranger situation to Jaycob, well, maybe not necessarily stranger because of what Middleton came in my opinion, but definitely a very strange situation like Jaycob Middleton, was that with Middleton, his name was kind of still on the radar, I would say. While I didn't want Middleton to actually play any games in the NHL this season, I imagined that the Sharks would kind of put his name into the lineup at some point because they had done so a few times over these past few seasons. For when it came to Megna, though, his name wasn't even on my radar. I thought that the Sharks would come into the season with Burns Ferraro, Carlson Knyzhov, Shemek Vlasic, and then have backup defensemen like Milosh, Merkley, Hataka, potentially even like a Kniazev. Honestly, I don't think Megna's name really even crossed my mind as a possibility, and he didn't seem like anything more than like a 10th defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. And yet, having said that, especially with Middleton having been traded at the trade deadline and the fact that Megna is signed for a couple more years, unless the Sharks actually go far out of their way to make a change on their defensive side of things, which I don't think is going to happen, considering the Sharks would likely want to focus on the offensive side of things for this coming off season. I imagine the Sharks could very well enter next year with a top four of Burns, Ferraro, and then Carlson and Megna. Obviously, Knyzhov's name is a potential part that he could move up into where he was last season in the 2021 season with Carlson, and then Megna could end up being like a third pairing guy or potentially a seventh defenseman. But the fact that Megna's name is even a big part of the Sharks' defensive core coming into next year is not something you would have expected to say just, let's say, 6 or 7 months ago, which is extremely impressive. On to the actual stats. 44 games played, 2 goals, 6 assists for 8 points. Obviously, like with Middleton, this is not a particularly big deal. He is more on the defensive side of things and was obviously playing with offensive defensemen like Burns, Carlson, and Merkley for the majority of the season, and those are going to be the guys collecting the points, not necessarily Megna. When it comes to his plus-minus, not necessarily as impressive as Middleton, but he still had a very solid -1, which, like I've said multiple times, is pretty good on a bad team like the San Jose Sharks, a team that missed the playoffs and gave up more goals than they scored. And so -1 for a defensive defenseman who, like I said, started his majority of his starts in the defensive zone is quite solid. And then his ice time is 19 minutes and 7 seconds. Like I said, down the stretch, he was pretty much averaging 19 to 20 minutes per game. The reason that this is slightly lower than that 20-minute mark is because during those few games that he played, during that COVID situation for the San Jose Sharks, besides the one game where he got 24 minutes against the Buffalo Sabres, he played sort of like 12 to 17 minutes in those other few games, and so it was deflated slightly because of that, but that is still 4th on the team in terms of defensemen, pretty much tied with Middleton, like I said, and he also was 3rd on the team in terms of defensemen for shorthanded ice time. So it seems as though, especially if Bob Booner is the head coach come next season, he is a fan of Jaycob Megna, so he could very well end up being a decent part of the Sharks defensive core next season. And so in terms of a grade, he ends up pretty much identical to Jaycob Middleton with a B. Class dismissed.